everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. Our goal for today, first of all, I hope everyone had a beautiful Chag. And I know we've had a bit of a break since we've studied together. So I'm hoping I actually had something now. I had something that I really wanted to show you, and let me just bring it.
Saw this Talmudic passage, or entered the orchard, the Pardes.
Oh, sorry, that's not supposed to be there. Let me get rid of that. Here we go. Here we are. And I'm going to be sharing this with you shortly. But before we do that, I just want to get our bearings. We are studying Kuzari, and then we're going to a little bit of the Kuzari today, and then we're going to go into something about Parshat Acharei-Kedoshim. So, hold on a second. Got our ad for. Skip that. And
what is truth?
Okay. All right. So where we are in the Kuzari is in the fifth essay, which I mentioned to you, we'd be skipping some parts of the fifth essay. And just where we are in the fifth essay is something that we want to catch up on. So where we are is on page 497 in the Feldheim edition, for those of you who have the book with you. And what we read up until now at the beginning of the fifth essay is something which I think is one of the most important sections in the Kuzari, because it really describes Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's whole outlook, his whole philosophy towards the pursuit of knowledge, as a way of helping us grow spiritually and become closer to Hashem. Unlike great rabbis that came before and after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, like Rabbi Saadia Gaon and the Rambam, who believed that the pursuit of an intellectual approach to Judaism was only going to enhance a person's closeness with God, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is contrary to that. And he very much believes that if you try to take a philosophical approach, like you try to take a methodology that is employed by other wise people of your time, like the secular world or philosophers of other religions, and you try to prove the faith claims of Judaism using intellectual arguments, you will at some time arrive at the truth. But on the road to truth finding, you may actually crash and burn. And therefore, it's better if you accept the faith claims of Judaism on faith, instead of trying to prove them based on using intellectual, rigorous proofs to prove things like God was the creator, and there is only one God, God is completely unitary, and that God allows prophecy to come to man in certain ways. And the ideas of reward and punishment and divine providence and the afterlife and things like that. These are all things that by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's own admission can be proven through logical argumentation. But since there's so many things that could derail that process and make you end up thinking the opposite of what the Torah wants you to believe, you're better off not even going down that path. Now, with that preface to the fifth essay, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi said, but don't think that I'm suggesting this because I am completely unlearned and I'm uneducated and I'm not familiar with the various arguments that can help us understand Hashem logically and the faith claims of Judaism. I am aware of the various different philosophies that are out there, and I'm going to give you a smattering, he says, of what different philosophers of my time have to say, and that will show you that I know what I'm talking about, and that there are, Shalom, welcome back, and that there are certain ways that a person can intellectually prove the faith claims of Judaism. Some of the things that I'm going to present you are means to help you get there, and some of the things that I'm going to present you are like prerequisite bits of knowledge about reality that you have to know in order to be able to understand the way Hashem created the world. Because that's the entree, that's the way to do it. Now, admittedly, the way that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi organizes this sort of philosophical presentation is somewhat haphazard. And so we're going to therefore be skipping a number of things where he gets sort of deep into the weeds of Greek philosophy and different schools of philosophy that existed in his time. There were many different ways of thinking about reality in the world. There was the Platonic view, there was the Aristotelian view, there was the Kalamist view, which took a totally different view of reality from the way Aristotle and Plato looked at it. And as a result, there's a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot of disagreement. And one of the things that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is going to tell us is that this is one of the reasons why it's not kedai, it's not worth it for us to be going down this road, because we're going to be encountering so many different approaches to understanding God's universe that we're not going to really know which way is up and which way is down, which path we should follow and which we shouldn't. Now, you contrast that with Rebbe Sadia Gaon and the Maimonides and the Rambam, and they take a completely different approach. They say, yeah, there's a lot of confusion out there, but we're going to take one approach which we think is correct, and we're going to use that methodology to prove the faith claims of Judaism. And that's why Rabbi Sadia Gaon wrote a book called Emunot V'Deot over a century before the Kuzari was written. And the Rambam wrote the Moreh Nevuchim at least half a century after the Kuzari was written. So the Kuzari is sort of sandwiched in between these rationalists, and he's known also as the proto-Kabbalist because he takes a decidedly more mystical approach where it's not so much the intellect that you need in order to connect with Hashem, but you need pietism and sort of whatever we would associate with spirituality instead of intellectualism. That's the approach that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi takes. And that's why he's so embraced by the Hasidic world as well, because it's not an anti-rational approach, but it's sort of sidesteps rationalism in trying to understand Judaism, trying to understand what the Torah is all about. Okay, so this is all just review. And he basically said, I'm going to show you that I know this stuff. And then at the end of a lot of pages of discussion, he's going to say, and that's based on everything I wrote, and so many of the disagreements that exist among the philosophers themselves, that's why I feel you're better off not getting started on this path. But at least I've shown you that there is a lot to know out there, that if you were insistent on using that derech, on using that path, you could use certain aspects of what we would call secular philosophy to help you prove the truths of Judaism. Okay? Any questions at this point? So let's see what he says. Now, I will now begin. And what he's now about to present to us is such a basic idea about Aristotelian philosophy that I felt it was worthwhile for us to spend a little bit of time on it, even though it's something that a lot of I wish that I had known the information that is contained within the next two paragraphs. I wish I had known this much, much earlier in my life, and I'm going to tell you why. It is completely different from the way that we view scientific reality, of all physical reality in the universe. Aristotle had an approach called the theory of forms, or dualism, and it has even an even fancier name, which I'm not going to go into right now. But Aristotle believed that everything that is physical in the universe, whether it's a cup of coffee, whether it's a mouse, whether it's a chair, whether it's a table, or even human beings, we are all a duality of existence, which means that we're made up of two different things. Can I just remind everyone to turn off your devices or to put them on mute? Thanks. So, what do I mean by that? The simplest way is when we look at the words of our sages. What do our sages tell us? That every human being is a duality of what? Every human being is a duality of two things. What am I talking about? Body and soul, guf and neshama. Now, this is exactly up the alley of Aristotle, because what makes you, you? Is it your body or is it your soul? When you look in the mirror, what part of you is you? So you can't say, well, it's my eyes, because if, God forbid, I didn't have eyes, I would still be me. It's not my ears, it's not my nose. If, God forbid, those things were missing, I would still be me. It's not my arms, it's not my legs. It's not even my major organs, because there's still something of the me-ness of me. What makes me me? So we look at it, there's something that is non-physical. You can call it your consciousness. In Judaism, we call it the neshama, we call it the soul. That's what makes you, you. What is the rest of the things that are part of you, that make you who you are, but are not the essential ingredient of who you are? Your body. Your body is which one is more important about making you, you? Is it the body or is it the soul? Okay, it's the soul, clearly, because a body without a soul is a $1.98 of chemicals, and the soul without the body is an ethereal, eternal being that dwells in paradise or in some kind of afterlife, right? It's eternal, it's indestructible, and so forth. That should act as an example of the theory of matter and form, or the theory of forms, that Aristotle had come up with. And Aristotle, it's important for you to know, Aristotle lived in the period of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. So by the time we get to the period of the Talmud and the Midrash, the rabbis are very much aware of this Aristotelian duality of all that exists. And therefore, when they present this idea that that every human being is made of body and soul, they are tapping into Aristotle. And so before I go any further in the text, I want you to look at a quick 5-minute video from a very nice, looks like, by the way, he looks like a Franciscan monk, because, not just rabbis study this philosophical stuff, but monks do also, and, people of other faiths. So I'm going to share this with the people in TV land also. Let's see how I do this. Just give me one sec. And I've got to share sound, and I've got to optimize for video viewing. And I'm doing that. Okay. And now I'm going to press.
What is love? What is justice? When asking these questions, philosophers are asking for the essences of things, or more simply, what they are. The ancient philosopher Plato called the answers to these questions the forms, and he held the view that the forms exist in reality, separately from the particular things around us in nature. Aristotle also held that the forms are real, but he held that the forms exist in the things themselves around us in nature. In other words, Aristotle thought that things have essences, or natures, or forms, which make them to be what they are. The form of a particular German shepherd, for example, makes him to be a German shepherd. All things of nature have their forms or essences, and because they have their forms, they fall into the assortment of natural kinds that we observe around us in nature. Aristotle also realized that particular things are composed of matter. For Aristotle, matter is not just atoms or particles or tiny units as we are accustomed to think of it today. For Aristotle, matter is the universal substratum of pure potentiality that does not exist on its own except in union with a form, which makes it to be this or that kind of matter. All the things of nature are composed of matter and form, and this is what is called hylomorphism.
Theory of matter.
Hylomorphism is a view about the constitution of the things of nature. The distinction between matter and form is related to the distinction between act and potency. The form of a thing is its act, and the matter of a thing is its potency. Just as things are a blend of potency and act, so they are a blend or a composition of matter and form. This holds at all levels of analysis down to the most fundamental units, which Aristotle called elements. Even the elements are composed of matter and form. It is the forms of things that make them to be intelligible, and when we ask what they are, it is their form that answers our question. For readings, podcasts, and more.
Okay. Did anyone understand what he was saying? Okay. 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 Hylomorphism is the technical name for what is being described, and it's essentially using the example of the human being as an example of this model, which really applies to everything. Everything is made of a body and a soul. Everything is made of two parts, which Aristotle called matter and form. The matter is the physical stuff that is unformed, and when it joins with the form of something, like the neshama, it becomes a total being. Let's take a chair, for example. Those of you in the room can see that I'm holding up a chair. Let me just stop the share. So I'm holding up a chair. The chair is made up of fabric, of metal, of plastic. Now, according to Aristotle's model, even a chair has a guf and a neshama, has a body and a soul. The body of the chair is the raw elements of plastic, metal, fabric. But if you just had those raw elements without somebody giving those elements form, they would just be blobs on the floor. And what form does is it takes the mind of the artisan who's going to be putting this chair together, and it instills within the blob, the shapeless matter, it gives it shape, contour, texture, and all of those other things. That's the idea of a guf and a neshama within every object, even inanimate objects. Now, you might think, well, this is an Aristotelian idea. What does this have to do with Judaism? The answer is that so many of our classic writings are based on this model. How many of you, when you were in seminary, studied the Maharal? Anyone ever study Maharal? The Maharal lived at the cusp of a new Enlightenment era. He lives in the 16th century, and he lives at a time when Aristotle is about to be disposed of for a different model of physical reality, which comes with the advent of Newtonian physics, of Newtonian science, and a different way of explaining reality. But up until that point, and this is included in the writings of the Maharal, everything is made up of matter and form. And what terminology does the Maharal use for matter and form? Chomer and surah. Has anyone ever heard those terms before? Chomer and surah. Those, whenever you encounter that in the writings of the Maharal, he is creating that hylomorphistic dualism that we're describing here. Now, the reason why I said I wish I would have known this when I was a bacher in yeshiva is because I tried studying the Maharal, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me whenever I encountered those terms, Chomer and Surah, because they were not familiar to me, because you won't find them in Talmudic texts. You find them in later texts, in medieval texts. But you find them in the Rambam, and you find them in the Maharal, and you find them in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and you'll find them in so many other important Sifrei Machshava, books on Jewish thought, that in order to be able to make heads or tails of these ideas, you have to have at least a small smattering of grounding in Aristotelian science. And that's why when I did the translation for the Kuzari, I included as one of the appendices a brief primer with different definitions of things that you'll find in Greek philosophy. So if you look at the appendix of the Kuzari, I think it's, let me just remember, it's Appendix A. It starts on page 597. I'm not going to go into all of the prefatory material, but what I will say is that if you go to page 603 in the back of the book, I have a small paragraph on what matter and form are. Aristotle had a conception of the nature of physical objects that is very foreign to our modern way of thinking. He believed that every physical object consisted of two things, matter and form. Matter is the raw material from which the object is made, and form is the structure, arrangement, and appearance of the object. Matter is physical, while form is non-physical. The two are separable only in theory. Let us use a wooden chair as an example. The matter of the chair is wood, while the form of the chair is the shape and structure of the chair. Where did this form come from? According to Aristotle, form originates from a non-physical source, and in the case of the chair, it came from the carpenter's mind. The carpenter developed the form of the chair in his mind and transferred this form to the wood. With regard to the creation of animals and human beings, Aristotle asserted that the father's sperm provides the form, whereas the mother's blood provides the matter for the fetus. And ultimately, Hashem provides the form in the case of the neshama, and mother and father provide the matter of the human body.
It's similar to what Adam did when he named each of the creatures, or not really, because it wasn't breaking it down into matter and form at that time.
That's a very good question. Well, I'm going to rephrase Toby's question. She's talking about Adam naming all of the different animals in the garden. So the question really is, can you reverse engineer the Bible to read Aristotle in the Chumash itself? And the answer is that's precisely what many of the Meforshim do. You would have to say that Adam examined both the matter and the form of every living creature. But you can go even further back in the Chumash. If you go further back in the Chumash and you look at what it says in the very second pasuk of the Torah, the haaretz hayita tohu vavohu, the choshech al pnei tehom, that the earth was chaos and void. According to the Ramban, and I refer you to his commentary at the very beginning of the Torah, maybe we'll look at that together. The Ramban is of the opinion that what the Torah is describing is pure matter without form. In other words, when Hashem created the universe, he first created matter without form, and then imbued his divine form, which is from the mind of God, into all formless matter. And that's what's happening over the 6 days of creation. In other words, at the initial moment of creation, all you have is formless matter. And then over the 6 days, Hashem is imbuing this formless matter with the form of Hashem's mind, and that were the words of God that create all of the organization that we find among physical items within the universe that we inhabit. So, and as a matter of fact, there is a word in Greek that describes this matterless, formless matter, and it's called hule. Some people spell it as Hule, some people spell it as Hyle. I don't know how to spell it in Greek. but in Hebrew it's Hey Yud Vav Lamed Yud, and that's what the Ramban is talking about when he describes Hiyuli or Huli. So these are ideas that are so crucial when we're learning so many of our Parshanim on the Chumash, Sifrei Machshava, that's the reason why I thought it would be worthwhile for us to at least begin with this discussion of matter and form, and then we're going to skip a lot of other things. Okay, so we'll save the text for next week, and let's for now. So we'll just we'll skip the text now because it's already late. Let's go on to our parsha, and then we'll take it from there. Okay. And I may have to finish just a few minutes early today as well, for which I apologize. Okay, Parshat Acharei-Kedoshim, seek guidance from the right sources. Parsha, and I'm going to focus on Parshas Kedoshim in particular, even though there's a lot to glean from Parshas Acharei-Mos that is related to this. There are 3 times in Parshas Kedoshim where the Torah warns us and tells us about the evils of seeking out Ov and Yidaoni. Now, Ov and Yidaoni are ancient idolatrous practices that were in vogue in the time when the Torah was given to the Jewish people. We don't really even understand that well what Ov and Yidaoni are, although they are described in more detail in the Mishnah, which I will present you with in just a moment. According to the Rambam, and this is a bit controversial, there are many commandments that God gave us in the Torah that are meant to address the cultural, fashionable mores of the society at the time when the Torah was given. Which means, even though we're used to saying that the wisdom of the Torah is timeless, we still agree with that in general, the ideas and the foundation and the basis of everything that is contained in the Torah is timeless and has applications to each and every individual in each and every era and period of Jewish history. But it's still important to know that there are historical bases for many of these mitzvot. So when the Torah says you may not pursue Oven Yidoni, that mitzvah doesn't speak to us today in the way that it did when Oven Yidoni were witchcraft or sorcery practices that were prevalent at the time when the Torah was written. Okay, does that make sense? Does anyone have a problem with that? It's not a heretical idea, it's something that we're not used to associating with, right? Yeah.
About the mitzvahs in the Torah were given for all time, not just for specific times.
Right, and that's why I preface this all by saying that the mitzvahs of the Torah do have lessons that are applicable to every single generation, but we got to be real. Also, we have to be honest. If Oven Yidoni has not existed as a practice within society for the last 3,000 years, then there may be some kind of ethical lesson that we learn from Oven Yidoni, and that's what I hope to demonstrate momentarily. But it's certainly not something that we would try to put into practice to the point where the Torah has to command me, "Thou shalt not pursue an Oven Yidoni." Okay? Yeah.
It might have occurred then, and then it doesn't.
Certainly, and it could take on a different name. Yes, absolutely.
And there are groups of people now that practice
Witchcraft,
yes,
Wicca, whatever it is.
not this. Talk about like some of the helping people.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
even it's
Yes, that's true. Okay, so there are 3 places in our parsha. The first place is in Perek Yutes, where the Torah says, "Al tifnu el ha'ovot ve'el hayidaonim." Do not turn towards ovot and yidaonim. Al tivakshu l'tom avahem. Do not seek to defile yourself through them. Ani Hashem Elokechem. I am the Lord your God. That's at the beginning of Parshas Kedoshim. And it's also interesting to note, and that's something that I want to explore in just a moment, that right afterwards, the Torah gives us the mitzvah, mipnei seva takum v'hadarta pnei zaken. Stand in front of or in the presence of an elderly person and glorify the presence of an elder. V'yareta me elokecha ani Hashem. Fear your God, I am Hashem. Of course, anytime you find two mitzvot adjacent to each other, you'd want to figure out what does one have to do with the other. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. The next time you find this in Parshas Kedoshim is in, and by the way, in Parshas Mishpatim, much earlier in Sefer Shemos, it also has a caution against seeking out Oven Yidoni. So the rabbis tell us that in Parshas Mishpatim, when the Torah prohibits seeking out Oven Yidoni, it means that even though you don't practice that witchcraft or occult practice yourself, but if you seek out someone who does, like a shaman or some kind of, Jamaican, wise man, right? And you ask him to do Oven Yidoni to tell you something about your future, that's also a violation. Here, the Torah is prohibiting the actual practice itself. And then the Torah in Perek Chaf, there are two places. It says in Pasuk Vav, it says, what are the consequences of you practicing Oven Yidoni? V'natati et panai banefesh hahi, I, God, will turn towards that soul who practices Oven Yidoni, v'hichrati oto mikervamo, I will cut him off from his nation. Now, you would think that that's the punishment, and it's very appropriate for the Torah to say both the prohibition and the punishment. But then the very last pasuk of Parshas Kedoshim reiterates the punishment. V'isho isha ki vahem ovo yidoni mot yumatu. Any man or woman who is caught possessing Oven Yidoni shall be put to death. Ba'even yirgemu otam d'mehem ba'am. You will stone them to death. Their blood is on their own hands. It's in other words, they're to blame for their deaths. Okay? Now, that's the very last pasuk of our parsha. Now, what in itself is bothersome about this being the last pasuk of our parsha? Number one, why does the Torah have to repeat this? What their punishment is? If you've already told me they will be cut off from their people. And the second problem is, why is it the last pasuk of a parsha? Usually, a parsha is supposed to end on a positive note. Anytime you find a parsha ending on a really sour note, like what? Yeah, we always want to end on a positive note. This Shabbos' Torah reading is one of those few examples where the parsha ends on a sour note, on like a negative note. Put them to death, their blood is on their hands. And that's not a not a nice way to finish. We always, by the way, we make sure that when you finish an aliyah, even a person getting an aliyah would not finish on a pasuk like that. This is one of those few examples. And next week, when we discuss Parshas Emor, which has to do with the Kohanim, I'm going to try to answer that question. I'm not going to answer that question though today. So the first thing I want us to look at is what the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says, and it's reiterated by Rashi in his commentary to the Chumash here a bit as well. But what is Ov and what is Yidoni? Those are two idolatrous practices. Ze pitom hamidaber mishichav. It is something called a pitom, which is some kind of skeletal remain that a person places in his armpit. That's literally what the Mishnah says. And as the Bartanur explains, Lokeach gulgolet shalmeit la'achar shenit akel. You take the skull of a corpse after it has decomposed, after the flesh has decomposed. You take, like in Hamlet, you hold up a skull. You take the skull of a deceased person, umaktirla, and you offer incense to that skull, v'shol mimena atidot, and you ask from this skull, what will take place in my future? So already what you're discovering is that why would a person seek out the Ov sorcery? They would seek it out because they want to know what's in their future. It's like the tarot cards of the ancient world. So you go to a fortune teller, and in the ancient world, there was, they were much more serious about it. No one uses a skull today, they'd get arrested. But you would take a skull, and sometimes they would take the skull and put it in their armpit, and they would hear voices coming from their armpit from a talking skull. Vihi mishiva. So, and the skull would respond and would give you the answer of what you want to know. Will I marry the girl? Or, what will happen when I go on the ship next week? Will the ship reach port successfully, or should I go to war? King Saul was quite guilty of summoning a sorceress, a witch of Endor, in order to try to find out whether he should go to war or not. We'll talk about that maybe next week. Now, the Yidoni zehamidaber b'fiv. And Yidoni is a similar act of sorcery, but instead of taking a skull and offering incense to it and sticking it under your armpit, it was, Rashi says, machnis etzem chaya sheshma yadua letoch piv ha'etzem medaber. You take a bone of a well-known creature. We're not going to go into all the details of what kind of creature this is, but it was known in the ancient world what kind of animal this was. It was a wild animal. You take its bone, stick it in your mouth, and then voices would come out of your mouth based on the sorcery and the supernatural nature of this animal. Harei-elu biskila. So if you perform either of these acts, either over Yidoni, a person gets stoned to death, v'hanish al bahem, and if you consult a person who practices Ovin Yidoni, you're violating the Torah. You don't get put to death for it, but you're in violation of the Torah. The objective, of course, is you want to find out what your future is. Now, what does this have to do, bless you, what does this have to do with the larger context of Parshat Kedoshim, which is to be holy? So part of being holy is to place your trust in God and not to try and orchestrate your future. And as the Sfas Emes points out to us, there are a series of commandments that are contained at the very beginning of Parshas Kedoshim, which seem to be haphazardly connected. It doesn't seem to be any kind of rhyme or reason why the Torah lists all of these mitzvot together. Ish imo ve'aviv tiro is the first commandment after you shall be holy. Fear or revere your father and mother. Observe my Sabbaths. Do not try to do any kind of divination or fortune telling about your future. Do not seek out Ovin Yidoni. There's a whole bunch of things that are contained in the very opening psukim of Parshas Kedoshim, which don't seem to be connected. But the Sfas Emes says that they really are connected. The rest of the world, he says, tries to orchestrate their future and choreograph what's going to take place in their lives because they don't believe that there's a God who is doing that for us. Aval livnei Yisrael ne'emar v'hayita rak lamala. But by contrast, the Jewish people said, you must try to be above all that. Perish, shelo yanichu lihitpashet ha'chochma lihitdabek b'chochmot chitzoniot. Don't allow the wisdom of the world to attach itself to external impure things. Rak lihiyot lamala tamid, lihiyot haguf batel el haneshama. But just the opposite. Instead of trying to use physical means of trying to harness control over your life, let your body be ancillary to your soul instead of the other way around. And just like that's true with every individual, it is true with the pursuit of wisdom in general. Sheminovlot chokhmah yesh sigim. He says, because when we talk about the categories of wisdom, we know that there is impure dross, vehi chokhmat hateva, shemisham yesh hakishuf v'tumat ov v'yidoni. A person can tap into what we would call the occult that exists as a natural product of the physical world. And according to the Sfas Emes, witchcraft or the practice of the occult is a real thing, meaning that a person has the ability to tap into supernatural forces that are embedded within the natural world. And that's why people in the ancient world practiced witchcraft and sorcery, because these things were real. Now, I should point out, as sort of like in parenthetically, according to the Rambam, the reason why the Torah prohibits things like Oven Yidoni is not because you're tapping into some kind of physical occult practice that's real, but rather because these things are purely superstitious and you're demonstrating your lack of intelligence by tapping into things that are nonsensical. That's the Rambam's approach, because he's a rationalist. But according to the school of Jewish mysticism, which is in Hasidus, and the Ramban subscribes to this as well, there really is substance to the occult. But you're not allowed to tap into it, because then you're making the physical world primary and the spiritual realm secondary. V'yesh ba'olam shana nefesh beit hadrachim. Now, these three terms, olam, shana, and nefesh, where have we seen those three terms before? Now I'm really testing you. For those of you who have been coming to the Kuzari class, olam, shana, and nefesh. Does anyone remember where we learned about these three things? How about anyone on our chat? Rabbi, I can hardly hear you. Can everybody hear me okay? That's what someone said 5 minutes ago. I apologize for that. Is everyone able to hear me okay?
Well, olam is when you're talking about different worlds.
So there are three aspects of reality that were discussed in the book of creation, Sefer Yetzirah, which is the mystical work that is pre-Zohar, that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi introduced us to when we studied the fourth essay of the Kuzari. Okay, and the three aspects of reality, olam, nefesh, and neshama. What are they? Olam is space. Olam, shana, and nefesh. Shana is time, and nefesh is the human soul. The three are three different parallel aspects of creation: time, space, and the human spirit. Those all three are parallels, they all are interconnected, and there are so there's a three-part commonality to all of existence that connects time, space, and the human soul, to the point where the human soul is a microcosm of all of time and space, and time and space is a macrocosm of the human experience of the soul. Okay, so that's what we learned in Sefer Yetzirah. So he says the same thing is true in the mitzvot that Hashem gives us. Zelu umatzeh, v'lachein ketiv lo tochlu al hadam, that do not eat over the blood, which was an idolatrous practice that they would slaughter an animal and immediately eat while the blood was spilling out, as a matter of conjuring spirits. Hu kishuf benefesh, kimo ovi daoni. These were things that people would try to do to tamper with the soul realm by tapping into witchcraft and the occult. Lo tenachashu ben b'maaseh b'chinat olam. Do not do any divination, which is to try and discover whether I should go left or right using these types of occult practices, because then you're trying to manipulate space. And lo te'onenu ubizman kemo shekatuv ona ploni yafe. Do not use superstitious occult practices of onenut, which is to try to find out what times are more propitious than other times. Okay, so you've got supernatural or sort of witchcraft manipulations of nefesh, olam, and shana, the three realms of existence, using the spirit of man, using trying to control space and trying to control time. But those are the negative things that you're not supposed to tap into. Umul zeh b'kedusha lahavdil ben kodesh l'chol. to make a division between the mundane and the holy. So that's the reason why Shabbat is included at the very beginning of Parshat Kedoshim. Whereas some people try to do divination practices to try to control or manipulate my future as far as what times are more propitious than others, Hashem says, use the Shabbos as a time as to sanctify time instead of defiling time. So you have therefore these different aspects. You have benefesh, imo va'aviv tiro. In the spiritual realm, the Torah says, revere your mother and father. Those are the parties that are responsible for your human essence. And mipnei seva takum, and rise for the elderly. Bisman shabtotai tishmaru, in time. So that's the spiritual, the soul. In time, it's observe my Sabbaths. Ba'olam mikdashi tiro, and revere my holy places is assign sanctity to space. V'chol eila mosifim kedusha la'adam. All of these things add holiness. So if you look at the series of commandments, the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots that form the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim, the pattern you will see is that there are ways to defile time, space, and the human soul, and there are ways to sanctify time, space, and the human soul. All of those initial commandments that are contained at the beginning of Kedoshim tell you the recipe of avoiding defilement by using witchcraft for determining your spiritual fabric, your time, and your space, and instead do the mitzvot that elevate your soul, your time, and your space. Now, that's the general introduction to how we understand the juxtaposition of various mitzvot that appear in Parshas Kedoshim. I'm not going to list them all for you now because it would take us a while to do that, and we're a little short on time. But what I would recommend that you do sort of as a homework assignment, look at the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim, and you will see the various mitzvot that are organized in that way, and you'll see that the pattern that the Sfas Emes is trying to provide for us. Specifically, as to why the mitzvah of Mipnei Seva Takum, that show respect for your elders, is juxtaposed immediately after the prohibition of Ovin Yidoni, is something that is undertaken by the Abarbanel. And he's got a beautiful explanation, which I'm just going to read very briefly. And I'm going to try to cut into that. Shelo dai shehayu nimshachim achar kol hapulot ha'ela lahagot hadvar mativiyim kodem zmanam. That a lot of these occult practices that were done in the times of the Torah by the other cultures was done in order to find out what was in their future and what they could do to optimize future endeavors. Okay, he says they wanted to know what was going to happen in the future. They wanted to be able to manipulate what was going to happen in their future. He says, and that's why the Torah says, do not turn to those practices. Va'al zeh amar al tifnu el ha'avot ve'el ha'yidonim. And to that purpose, the Torah says, do not turn towards those practices. Rotze lomar ladate atid. Don't try to figure out what's going to be in your future. Va'al tevakru otam. Don't visit those practices, because all they're going to do is bring impurity to your life. But he says, how does God conclude that verse? Ani Hashem Elokechem. I am the Lord your God. Rotze lomar mashgiach bachem v'shochem b'tochechem. I'm dwelling among you, says Hashem. And if I'm dwelling among you, then you should have the bitachon that whatever's going to happen to you is going to be okay. And furthermore, ve'ein ra'ui shetavo'u lefanai tameim. And therefore, if I'm dwelling in your midst, you should not be engaging in these kinds of defilement practices. He says, ve'im tomru, but maybe you'll say, shetzrichim atem ladat hadivarim ha'atidim uletaken hadivarim hativim. But God, if I have access to the future events, I need to know. I need to know whether I should invest in this or not. I need to know whether I should go on that ship that might sink in the future. And if the sorcerers are telling me that they have knowledge about the future, how can you tell me? How can you restrict me and tell me not to do this? So listen to what the Abarbanel says. He says, Hine lahashiv al ze amar mipnei seva takum v'hadarta pnei zakeh. The response to that is, seek out your elders. Seek out the wise ones that are older than you. V'amar ze al hachachamim v'hanevi'im v'ziknei hador she'elech alehem. Instead of going to the fortune tellers and the necromancers and the talisman experts, go to the wise men of your generation, the elders and the prophets. V'yishal mehem, ask them what they think. Ask them their advice. V'heim yodi'um ha'amitiyut kulam. They'll tell you the truth. They'll give you the best advice that you can follow. Uvazeh yishtalmu b'sha'ol me'itam lo ba'o v'yidoni. And if you want to find harmony and peace in your life, seek out the advice of your elders instead of going to necromancers and fortune tellers and things like that. And that, in that way, you won't have to go to Oven Yidon. So the last thing I just want to leave you with, just to be able to sort of come up with a really concrete idea that's, and you, like you said before, Rachel, like, how are these things applicable? How is Oven Yidoni? How does it apply to modern times? Our youth, and you can go back to your own youth and remember this as well, we tend to poo-poo, we tend to disregard our elders. And we think they don't understand, it's a new era, and there's no wisdom in old age, and they don't get it, they're not with it. And sometimes, as if you're a parent of adult children, you may feel that they have that attitude towards you as well. I have my own way of raising my children. The way you raised us as children is not the way that we're supposed to raise children in this world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, unfortunately, who do our children consult with? The Oven Yidoni of the modern age. They think that, and this is especially true, but all of the experts and when my mother was raising us, she's consulted with Dr. Spock, right? But now that there's a whole new generation of parenting experts and these kinds of experts and social experts, and who explain to us that, oh, we got all the things we did wrong in the previous generation, and how we're going to correct the world and make it a better place. And it's turning out to be a disaster, not only in the realm of raising children, but in so many other realms of society today. The new ideas have turned out to be catastrophic to the cultural fabric of society. And why is that? Because instead of seeking out the elders for their wisdom, people are always forward-looking and thinking that they can advance and dispense with the archaic and outdated ideas of the past. And that's precisely what the Torah wants to deflect. You know what the Oven Yidoni of today is? Artificial intelligence. If you don't have to ask an elder, if you want to know something, just go to ChatGPT and you'll get all the information you need to get. And I think that's the reason why, as the Abarbanel is explaining to us, that's why these mitzvot are juxtaposed against each other. Yes, life can be very unsettling. We're all insecure about the future, and we don't really know what tomorrow brings. It's certainly understandable why someone would want to summon a device like Oven Yidoni to give them the security of knowing what's going to be in the future. But Hashem says that will only bring purity to your life. You want to bring purity to your life? Seek out the wisdom of the earlier generations, and that's what will give you the soundness of mind. Yes, there's always the ability to improve on the previous generation, no question. But if you discard the previous generation and think only that what you know and what your generation knows is right, and that the previous generation got it all wrong, then you're sort of seeking out Oven Yidoni at the expense of getting to the truth and leading a life of sanctity and purity. Okay, yeah, good. So I think this is a good place for us to hold it.
Okay, thank you.
Practically, am I allowed to use lottery numbers as advised by birthday astrologists? That's one of the questions that someone would like to practically know. Is a person allowed to use an astrologer's advice for lottery numbers? I think that, that's a practical question. The answer to that is, as long as you know that the astrologer's numbers are just as good as choosing 111111111. As long as you know that there's no science to it and there's no substance to it, and it's all really silliness, and you have just as much of a chance using the astrologer's numbers as any other numbers, then sure, knock yourself out. But if you believe that there's something to it, then that's not really permitted, because you're not supposed to invest a truth in soothsayers and fortune tellers. Okay, so we'll hold it here for today.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Thank you.